Wind farms have been hailed as part of the solution to climate change and to solving Australia's energy needs and driving down energy prices. Magical wind farms will provide clean, infinite, and cheap energy for all Australians. Or so we're told. But wouldn't you know it? There's no magic pudding. And there are trade-offs. And wind farms cost money and come with some downsides. So it is with wind farms that there are some issues to consider. Something that has finally dawned on Bob Brown of the Greens Party. It turns out the wind farms are not perfect and they in fact have some downsides. Now Bob Brown is obviously an environmentalist, being core to the Greens Party, very much in favour of getting on top of climate change. However, only if it doesn't affect him personally, it seems so far. He's perhaps the poster child now for environmental NIMBYism. You can engage in environmental initiatives as long as they're not in his backyard, and is now weighed in on wind farms, and decried the renewable free-for-all in his terms. He slammed Tasmania's plan to produce excess energy and to supply energy to the mainland, and he's argued that such a plan is motivated by developer interests, and by profiteering. Now Bob Brown is no stranger to decrying wind farms. He's previously talked about how they might affect the natural habitat of various birds. However, now the attack is on profiteering, so to speak. The Australian quotes him as saying, "Wind power is an essential part of the answer to global warming, but at the moment we have a free-for-all, and whenever that happens, there are reckless casualties." And the Albanese government is way behind industry on this. There are international as well as national wind farm developer interests looking at everywhere the wind blows. They are not doing it in service of the planet. I do say a small number of those wind farms that are environmentally unjustified, because the detriment is far greater than the benefit. That's not properly being safeguarded against at the state or the federal level. Some of these wind farms are going to end to be negative. The overall environmental offer is false because the impact on the environment is going to be bigger than the benefit. The real driving reason for that 200% renewables target is profiteering by people like ACEN, moving into a lucrative new market which is being forced by the exigencies of climate change. I'm afraid we're going to see more of this with massive wind farms lined up across the Australian environment to sell profitable renewable energy to Asia, either directly through cables or for hydrogen. We're in a calamitous situation for the environment, and nobody in this is much discussing energy efficiency, which is the cheapest and most environmentally sound source of new power. So Bob Brown appears to have had a bit of a change of heart about wind farms. He seems to like them, except when he doesn't. He seems to like wind farms, except when they might impact him personally or involve a degree of capitalism. Now Bob Brown does make a valid point. Not all wind farms are going to be good initiatives. Either they might be inefficient, they might be propped up by pork barreling or government initiatives or government funding, and they simply aren't going to be fit for purpose. They're going to cost more than they're going to save. Or they might generate environmental damage or be unsightly, and that might outweigh any environmental benefit they could ever generate. That is, not all wind farms are actually good. And he makes a very valid point. You need to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. That is inherently logical. That's something that should go without saying. However, the problem is that in the environmental push, sometimes people just go toward anything that looks vaguely renewable or environmentally friendly without really considering, well, how environmentally friendly is this really? Is it actually a good use of money? Will it actually achieve what we want to achieve? Sometimes people just look at these things ideologically and go all out. It's almost as if the Greens has educated people to engage in ideological warfare rather than actually think about things in a logical case-by-case manner. One wonders whether Bob Brown's own party is to blame for quite a lot of this occurring. The area where Bob Brown really errs is A, the appearance of hypocrisy, but also in addition to that, his aspersions against profiteering, so to speak. The issue, of course, is these wind farms need to be built by someone. Wind farms don't magically spring out of thin air. Wind farms aren't trees. They don't just grow when you hope that they grow. You can't just plant a seed and expect the wind farm to grow up and generate power for you. It doesn't work that way. Someone needs to build these things, much like someone would need to build solar powers, or they need to build coal-fired power plants or gas stations. All of these things need to be built by someone. And that means someone needs to think about the economic imperatives behind the thing. That is, you need to consider, will this wind farm actually generate more money than you are spending? especially considering all of the alternative uses of money you could have had. For example, if you're going to spend $100 million on a wind farm, would you have just been better off putting that $100 million into the ASX 200? That's something that investors need to consider. They need to consider what is the risk profile of the investment and also what return is it likely to generate. And with a wind farm, which is perhaps susceptible to government intervention, perhaps susceptible to government price controls and energy, well, the investors obviously face a degree of risk. It is not just risk-free cash they're going to be facing. So they need a return that could offset that risk and make that investment attractive relative to all the other uses of money that they could have. They need to consider the opportunity cost, so to speak. Now, Bob Brown, by criticizing profiteering, so to speak, is effectively criticizing the whole commercial basis for engaging in renewables. You need to be able to make money on any of these things. Much like you need to be able to make money on coal, or you need to be able to make money on gas, or you need to be able to make money on whatever it is. There needs to be a profit in the thing you are building for you to actually want to build it. That is something that Bob Brown appears to completely miss, because he seems to think these wind farms will just spring out of thin air. And we see this permeate throughout the Greens party, that appears to have absolutely no knowledge about economics or finance whatsoever. Now, Bob Brown is not involved in the Greens in Parliament at the moment. However, the current Greens have majorly problematic policies. For example, their idea to control rents. Well, if they're perhaps putting a cap on rents, do they actually think that people are going to build new properties? You just have to think logically about this. If you can't make money on the property, no one is going to build it to invest, and therefore you're not going to get any more construction, therefore you get all of these adverse economic effects. The Greens don't seem to be capable of thinking several steps into the future. Bob Brown, by criticizing profiteering, doesn't seem to realize what would happen to all of these environmental initiatives if you remove the profit imperative. How exactly are these things going to be built? Does he envisage that the government is going to come to the rescue and build all of these wind farms just out of the goodness of their heart? But even if they did that, where does the government's money come from? It comes from taxpayers. So if the government is building them, well, then they need to get the money from somewhere, which is going to involve tax hikes or reducing expenditure in other areas, or both. Now, if the government operated somewhat like the private sector, one could see a case for them building a wind farm and then effectively selling it off after it is built so that they can recoup their money. And in so doing, the taxpayer might actually get a return on their investment. However, how much do you actually trust the government to be efficient in this space? Do you trust them to actually build this wind farm, then grow it into something useful, and then sell it off to reap a profit to then reinvest in other initiatives? Now, the government could perhaps retain a small stake in it to generate some dividends, but do you actually trust the government to use these projects in that manner? Rather, it could just become yet another inefficient government enterprise that soaks up more and more money without the disciplinary mechanism of private markets. That maybe is what Bob Brown wants. He just wants total government control, perhaps. That's my interpretation, because if you remove the profit imperative, then who is going to build these things? It would obviously be taxpayer funded. But nevertheless, at least I'll give Bob Brown credit for seeing some sense here. It's important to evaluate these projects on a case-by-case basis, not just build more of them, because there are downsides in many of these renewables initiatives that might, in fact, offset some of the positives in some cases. Nevertheless, let me know your thoughts about wind farms in the comments below. And otherwise, if you're seeing this before Christmas, have a great Christmas.